As you can see from the slide before you, we'll be talking about the post-war economy of the United States, which entered the longest era of prosperity in United States history. It is, as you can see, all about the Benjamins. Prosperity began with World War II, though it was very difficult to understand at the time that prosperity would continue after World War II. Three things faced the first post-war president, Harry S. Truman. He had to reincorporate returning veterans into U.S. society and into the economy in particular, which was kind of a frightening thought. He had to repress either fiscal inflation, monetary inflation, or depression. No one at the time was sure which direction the economy was going to go. And he was faced, as the chief executive of the United States, with labor problems. Let's look at a graph here to show just how many people Truman was going to have to reincorporate into the economy. We went from a high of 12 million members of the armed forces, that is, people with jobs, many of whom were overseas, paid for by the government. And this and war munitions and other material plants were why the U.S. economy had recovered from the Depression. But would the Depression last? Would it come back? Would prosperity last? This graph in front of you shows the difficulty with even trying to figure out what was going on. Now, in our lifetimes, it is standard practice for the United States to maintain a fairly robust military presence. But that occurred in the aftermath of World War II and with the beginning of the Cold War and with the beginning of what I dare say may be considered by historians to be the American Empire. Our armed forces is smaller than it was during World War II, obviously, and even during the Vietnam War, but it is an unusual and relatively recent thing in United States history to maintain any kind of standing army. And you can see that with the end of World War II, between 1944 and 1947, of course it ended in 1945, that we demobilized very rapidly. Look at this is a 6-year spread. Look at the number of troops that we maintained in our standing army between 1944 and 1947. We went from 12 million to 1.5 million. And then we cut that in half, and even more than half, to 600,000 by 1950. We had to reboot, and that was a problem for the Korean War, but that came a little bit later, and it did not increase the number of troops back to that 12 million. So what were all these people going to do? Were they going to come back into the economy? Were they going to demand jobs? Were they going to be able to find jobs? What happens when they come back looking for jobs and there aren't any because there's no more need for war material or bomber planes or anything like that? Well, we just didn't know. So how did Truman respond to all of these things that he had on his plate? That is, reincorporating the vets, dealing with inflation or depression, and labor problems. Well, remember that Truman had been vice president since 1945, since January of 1945, having been a senator before that, and he became president on April 12, 1945. He had barely been a blip on FDR's radar. He had replaced Henry Wallace as vice president because Wallace was a far left-winger and Truman was a cipher. No one knew anything about Truman. He came out of the Pendergrast machine from Kansas City. And he was on the ticket to provide those Midwestern votes. FDR paid no attention to Harry S. Truman and did not plan for Truman to ever succeed to the presidency. Truman was a committed New Dealer, however, with he was not as ethereal as Rex Tugford had been in creating the New Deal in 1933. He was much more pragmatic. He was very much down to earth, but he was motivated by continuing the New Deal. So his domestic policies were similar to the New Deal. He wanted to expand employment insurance, or what we would call unemployment insurance. He wanted to maintain the Fair Employment Practices Commission that FDR had created in 1941 in response to A. Philip Randolph's threatening to have a march on Washington. It was Truman that created post-war low-cost housing for returning vets. And he wanted to maintain regional development and public works, very much like TVA and even the WPA program, if he found it to be necessary. He was prepared to continue to fight the Great Depression. One of the things that he was able to oversee that did, in fact, fight the Depression and I believe maintained prosperity and even launched greater prosperity, at least until the 1970s, was the GI Bill. The GI Bill passed in 1944 when Truman was in the Senate. And between 1944 and 1952, it spent between $13 and $17 billion to pay for college tuition and maintenance, a monthly payment, a monthly allowance for ex-GIs. It also gave fiscal assistance to business startups, and it provided housing assistance. So the GI Bill sent millions to school between 1944 and 1952. Millions of these returning vets went to school on the GI Bill. Some of them finished their high school diploma, their high school education, and received a diploma. Some of them went to trade and technical colleges, which sprang up all over like dandelions, some of which were excellent and became well established, like the Culinary Institute of America, for example, had its beginnings at the Yale University campus in an effort to create a cookery trade school for returning vets. Others went on to get college diplomas. And all in all, remember the Second World War had increased the desire for education and had made something of a god, you might say, out of technology and science. And so this was another era in which engineering and hard sciences were the coin of the realm. Students went crazy for engineering and hard sciences. There were lots of jobs in research and development. Technology was going to solve all of our problems. And people fervently believed this. So there was a lot of investment in technology. And the GI Bill helped to provide the infrastructure, the intellectual infrastructure, to service this growing technological economy. Here's the kicker. It took these guys out of the job market for a few years and allowed them to dribble into the job market so that they would not overwhelm a job market and thenceforth be unemployed. They weren't just cut off like World War I veterans were. They were eased back into the employment system. Not that they needed easing back in, some of them did, but the economy needed them to dribble in over time and not to hit like a tsunami. And this actually occurred. Well, the biggest problem that Truman faced and the American economy faced was not a return of the Depression. No, it was in fact that other shoe that fell, inflation, which can be just as devastating to an economy as a depression can be because it's out of control money expansion. the way that you feel inflation right on, and the way they felt it right after World War II, was in price increases across the board. As the government quit buying munitions and war materiel and had paid billions of dollars to workers through companies to create this war material, and to war material production took the place of consumer goods production. So what do you have? A situation in which consumers have not been able to buy anything in great numbers because of first the Depression, in which they had no money, and then the war, in which no one was producing any consumer goods. And yet during the war, workers were making money hand over fist. So there was this enormous pent-up demand for consumer goods, some of which were durables and some of which were comestibles. People wanted more and better food. They wanted cars. They wanted washing machines. They wanted vacuum cleaners. All of these trappings of middle-class life. There was an enormous middle class and a pretty well-to-do working class. Not as well-to-do as the upper crust, because profits had far outstripped wages, which led to labor issues. But they had a huge savings rate. Way too much money was in savings. And they started taking money out of savings, and they started spending the money they had been getting. There was this pent-up demand. There was also a reaction to rationing and wage and price controls. Wage and price controls had remained in effect into 1946, and in fact, at least rationing of meat and sugar had remained in effect even after the war ended. So people wanted to get away from rationing and price controls, and they had a pent-up demand. So psychologically, they were ready to buy things, and they had the means to do it because there was general prosperity. People were much better off than they had been for a while, and they were ready to shop. And when the demand outstrips the supply of any goods or services, then the price will go up. And prices went up across the board very quickly after World War II. Consequently, we see the demand by labor for wages to increase. Now, what occurred in 1946 and 1947 set the tone for how wages and prices would operate into the 1970s. That is, throughout the entire era of extraordinary prosperity that occurred in the U.S. economy. The way that wages and prices rose was determined kind of by accident in 1947. The unions that had refrained from striking during World War II, they had given a pledge that they would not strike during World War II, saw that profits had so far outstripped wages and that productivity was so high for each worker that unions demanded wage increases. Now, Truman considered in general, these union demands to be excessive. And one of the things that he considered excessive was actually the amount of money that some of the big unions wanted. They wanted an 18% increase in automobile work, wages for automobile work, and in steel. Many unions went on strike in late 1945 and through 1946 into 1947. It was these strikes that led, in some cases, to passage of the Taft-Hartley Act, which stripped away a lot of the pro-union ideas in the Wagner Act of 1935 that had made organizing substantially easier. Taft-Hartley made organizing substantially more difficult. But a lot of unions struck, like the miners union, railway workers union, steel workers union, all of these guys struck. Truman considered these strikes to be unnecessary, and Truman had kind of a short fuse anyway. So he actually threatened to draft the railway workers at one point, and he threatened to nationalize the mines and draft the miners. This would have hurt both labor and management. Would have punished them both for being unreasonable. Well, the solution to the whole thing ended up being a breakthrough in the settlement in the steel industry between labor and management, in which the steel workers had been demanding upwards of 25% wage increases. They were allowed an 18.5% wage increase, but the steel companies were allowed to increase their prices. Now, we could go into an in-depth discussion about what labor wanted. They didn't want to pass prices along to the consumer. They thought that profits should go to pay for these wage increases, and they wanted to look at the books of the steel companies. Well, all of this was worked out, and this set the pattern for other industries at the time, but it also set up the way that wages and prices would increase over the next 25 years in what's called the wage price spiral. Now, if you as a student are over about 40, you probably, 40 years old, you probably remember discussions of the wage price spiral and how awful it was. But it was a way to control the distribution of profits and wages across the face of the economy. Of course, there are problems with it, but it allowed control rather than a battle between workers and management or workers and owners, which was what the progressive era of the early 1900s had tried to introduce into the battle between labor and owners of the 19th century, this control, this concept of control, and this concept of the public interest. And the settlement in steel in 1947, which led to the wage price spiral, was actually an exercise in creating the public interest as not being a player with labor or not being a player with management, but being, I guess, a partner in the whole thing. Well, Truman's entire program, we normally refer to it as the fair deal. This pings off of the New Deal of FDR, which had pinged off of the Square Deal of Theodore Roosevelt earlier, and was articulated, and that phrase was coined for the State of the Union message of 1949. But again, it's one of those phrases that catches enough attention that historians, looking back over the entirety of the Truman years, have applied to his whole program. Remember earlier he had wanted to expand unemployment insurance, continue the Fair Employment Practices Commission, establish low-cost housing, have regional development and public works. Well, by 1949, he had created a program. Now, you know that Truman came so close to losing the election of 1948 that the Chicago Tribune, I believe, which was very much anti-Truman, had already printed its headline of Dewey defeats Truman. And though I don't have a copy of the image here, there is a famous image from the day after the election in which Truman is holding up a Chicago Tribune, it might have been the Sun-Times, I don't remember, newspaper dated the day he's holding it up, says, and banner headline says, Dewey defeats Truman. Well, Truman had defeated Dewey. And in 1949, giving his State of the Union address about a year after the election, months after the election,
He called upon Congress. He had run against a do-nothing Congress in 1948, and he called upon Congress to do something to extend the New Deal with national health insurance. I mean, my goodness, we went through what was derisively called Hillary Care, which did not pass in the 1990s, and in the 2000s, in 2012, we are dealing with what is derisively called Obamacare, again, a national health insurance program that began primarily under the Fair Deal in 1949. Agitation began in 1949. Truman agitated for a civil rights bill, which would have been the first to pass since the Civil Rights Act of 1875. He asked for federal aid to education, and he asked for a program of subsidized farm income. This was the Fair Deal. Congress balked at every bit of it. They did not pass health insurance. They didn't pass a civil rights bill. The next civil rights bill would be in 1957. They did not pass federal aid to education. That would come under Johnson in the 1960s. And they did not subsidize farm income, which again would happen in the 1960s. Anyway, this is how prosperity began and how President Truman, using the power of the office of president, which had increased and increased and increased, particularly under FDR, then became a major player in how the economy of the United States was going to work in his era and in eras that came after him, including our own. So again, thank you for your attention.